let's dive into that, and we'll start with a introduction of the two guests. And maybe if I can ask first, Keith, just to give quick intro to yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, hi, Keith MacDonald. I'm based in London. I look after the work we do at EY in the wealth management private banking industry. So that's the bank-owned and independent players, and I think importantly to this, all the technology and infrastructure providers that support that supply chain. So always been based in London, but many years, I think many is the appropriate word, isn't it, Ned? Working in this industry across wealth management and private banking.
And maybe, Keith, I can start with you. You've, as you said, you've been in the wealth space for a long time. You've seen it change. Being at EY, you've obviously worked with a large range of different clients. When we think about personalization, as you mentioned before, JP Morgan with Nutmeg and different clients, everybody's kind of jumping in to be part of it. What are your thoughts of that in the financial advice space, Keith?
Well, it's interesting it uses the word recent in the question. I mean, the last 16 months have thrown so much up in the air in every aspect. And I think it accelerated an awful lot of things as well as caused a lot of issues. I think a lot of the acceleration of the digitization of this has been part of that as well. So I think it's raised a load of questions for companies of all shapes and forms, but also for customers as well in terms of their own financial positions. Inevitably, these sorts of economic problems throw that up in the air anyway. So I do think recent, if we'd asked this question 18 months ago or maybe 2 years ago, we'd have probably had very different answers to what we're looking at now, particularly when we look forwards. So I think point one is it's all up in the air, and there are patterns coming through, but some of these patterns are still quite difficult to pin down, particularly about which players are playing with which services in which markets and types of clients, be it ultra high, family office end, all the way through to mass affluent. And I was going to say, I think the second piece of that is the definitions of some of these terms. Advice as a term under different regulatory environments means very different things. I mean, if I look from a UK perspective, advised and non-advised or guided, there's a load of debate around what those terms mean, and they're also point in time terms. A piece of advice now could be execution only, but in a context that actually could bring different types of implications further down the line, be it tax or others. So I think not avoiding the question, but when you start unpicking the question, there's an awful lot of complex elements to it, I think.
Do you think the clients you talk to are fearful of the future or greedy in the future when it comes to digital and personalized wealth?
Well, that's a very, very different question. And I think it opens up a completely separate part of what's going on at the moment. There's greed and fear, but I think there's an awful lot of discussion and reality around purpose and broader issues. And that isn't just an ESG regulatory tick box exercise. That is a real challenge now coming in from an awful lot of people. So yeah, I don't think I've never heard anybody saying they're afraid of the new technology. I think what it does is it facilitates these relationships. I think if you look back to last March, April, as everybody rushed to plug in e-signature tools because they had to, some of the traditional ways of interacting with clients were broken, and because they had to be broken, you couldn't meet face to face, so you had to use these tools. So all sorts of different people who had gone into the office to do it, etc., etc. So I agree with Samir, but I think it's more complex than that. I think if you look at an individual or a family, a set of people over a 2, 3, 5 year period, I think the input measure approach in the past has been, look, we haven't seen them for 2 months, we must go and see them. I think now it's more about what are they doing, and if we need to see them, we'll see them, and if we need to get them to sign something, we'll ping them a note, and let's make sure they're getting information, probably digitally, about what's going on in the markets. But if something happens, I mean, something like a death or a marriage or something shifts and the transaction happens, that's when I do agree that the personal interaction happens. So I don't think this, I mean, we bandied this word hybrid around a lot in terms of personal and digital interaction. To me, that's not, it's always hybrid at each stage of each relationship. And I think it's very much transaction and event driven. And I also think it's sort of, to throw it back to the personalization side, it needs to be a bit self-served as well. I mean, we talk about self-service in terms of completing data, making sure firms know enough about individuals and families about what they're doing. But that also can help trigger when the interactions and how those interactions should change as well.
If we just put up the next question, because that's actually looking at the specific use cases. Here we go. So I like your point, Keith. Exam questions. Sometimes I do deviate from them. So why don't we go for that, Keith? On this question, maybe I'll just hand it right over to you.
Well, this is always a fun one from my perspective, because we try to serve the whole market in this. So it's not just our organisation; it's our clients, and I suppose we see the full spectrum. I mean, we see almost trying to rebadge investment managers as planners, which doesn't, that's, I mean, I've shown my age by saying it's the old teller-seller debate. You can retrain, but it's a different discipline. You see different large and small organizations looking at how to manage a customer interface, customer relationship, and switching almost between planning and advised and non-advised, depending on stage of where the relationship is, things like that. So I think there are patterns, but there's a long way to go before it settles into, I think even within one country, it settles into a particular pattern, never mind when you start looking internationally.
And you've mentioned this term pattern a couple of times. I like that idea. Could you maybe highlight, it's like, again, it doesn't, I know that it, as you said, it is all up in the air, but when you think about the different patterns that you're seeing, is there anything that you see repeatedly, as you say, talking to different clients, that you would say is kind of first and foremost?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I think what Samir was saying as well, it's this use of technology to support the personal relationship and the personal relationship at the appropriate time. And again, back to what I was saying before in terms of this life stages and events that support it. So I think that's a pattern instead of trend, whatever we call that. I think is one of the most positive things, that this concept of hybrid personal and technical support for individuals and families is becoming a real reality now. And how that actually looks in 2 years' time and 5 years' time, I think will depend on a whole set of stuff. I mean, we hardly mentioned data in these discussions so far as well. I mean, mixed views about artificial intelligence, analytics, and the use of analytics to support particularly more complex relationships and wealth management. I think there's a huge place for analytical tools and data in the mass market, mass affluent going into affluent. Trickier to use those sorts of tools to support more complex relationships. But again, it's shades of grey to me. It's not like, here's a set of tools for this part of the market, here's a set of tools for that part of the market.